All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host. I'm here with Sam Miller. What's up, Sam?
Hey Rachel, thanks for having me. I really do. I really appreciate the name of your podcast. It's very clever, given the role of Netflix and kind of modern entertainment and everything. So when I saw that, I was like, cool, Netflix and chill. I feel like I should be on that podcast.
Yeah, right. I mean, it came to mind like one night because when I was thinking about putting this podcast out, I was like, what the heck am I going to name it? Like, I didn't want it to just be like nutrition and health, like whatever. I wanted to be something that people like saw, like you said, and they're just like, oh, that's a cool name. And really the podcast it's all about kind of just exploring different avenues of nutrition, fitness, mindset, and just kind of having people on who, you know, want to talk about it and just have a chill conversation. So I thought it went well.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. And better
Awesome.
content than the Netflix nutritional documentaries. So looks like moving in the right direction.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So, do you want to give our listeners just a little background on who you are and kind of how you got into the nutrition and fitness space before we get started?
Yeah, sure. So for the listeners, obviously my name's Sam. I primarily work in the continuing education space for health, fitness, and nutrition coaches, speaking largely on topics related to metabolism, hormones, complex cases, what to do after kind of stints of chronic dieting, and also explaining some of the nuances of physiology, which I think sometimes people make very complicated. And the folks who like to educate on those topics or teach on those topics sometimes make them complex so that other people don't understand them. I try to take those complex concepts and basically translate it in a way where the average person could use that as leverage for their goals. So that's kind of what I dive into, where I spend most of my time. And my content is geared both for health and fitness enthusiasts as well as coaches who want to learn more about some of these topic areas that aren't covered very much. So whether it's a coach in their initial certification, or maybe it's, you're in your own transformation and you read like women's health or men's health, or just common, you know, Instagram influencers, whatever it is, it's information that I found wasn't super covered when I got into my health and fitness journey. And so I tried to basically create a reliable source of information for other people, just so that they found something like outside of just, hey, I need to track my calories, or protein is good, and what about carbs and fats, and kind of branching out beyond that and giving people kind of a greater understanding of what's going on inside of their body.
I love that. I love that. And that's kind of exactly why I wanted to have you on because I've listened, like I mentioned, when you were off air, I've listened to you on other podcasts, been following your content for a while, and I really love how you like break down these complex topics into understandable, ways of understanding it, understandable ways of understanding it. Wow. Um, ways of like learning it. And you have a lot of these analogies. And I want to kind of dive into that because I think this is, and I mentioned this before, like this is one topic that I haven't dove into too much with other guests or even on solo podcasts, just the kind of breaking down metabolism and talking about it in a way that people who might not have, a background in physiology or background in like even knowing what metabolism is, and then kind of diving into some things involved with or like hormones and all of that and kind of breaking that down as well. So maybe we can start by just like, how would you define or explain like what metabolism is to someone who literally has no idea?
Yeah, I find that most people think of metabolism like one of two ways. One, it's like how fast do I digest my food? Like if I have a fast metabolism, I don't gain fat. If I have a slow metabolism, then I do gain fat. That's kind of how people think of it. Or just they think of it as like my metabolism is in my stomach, and then whatever happens when I eat my food, it's like that will dictate my body composition. When in reality, your metabolism is basically responding to a number of different things, both internal and external stimulus. And so external things could be stress in your life. It could be your environment, the amount of sunlight you get, getting outside, fresh air, movement, things you're doing in your daily life, and then internal stressors. So that could be inflammation, toxicity. There's really a whole host of things going on, as well as chemical messengers, things like hormones that are basically sending signals to your metabolism, which really, I would argue that if we had to pinpoint like a location in the body where so many metabolic activities are regulated, it's really like your brain, because of everything that goes on with endocrinology and hormones and how that pertains to your thyroid and your overall metabolic health. So when I talk about physiology, when I talk about metabolism, and when I talk about hormones, a lot of it is that communication between the brain and then other glands and tissues and areas of the body. So that could be, the adrenals or your gut or your thyroid. But think of your metabolism as like a system or network of communication. And one of my good friends also kind of refers to it as like a stress barometer. I always really like that analogy too. It's kind of a gauge when we're thinking in terms of like what we're experiencing in our life. And our body, so basically the goals that we're trying to achieve, whether that's a body composition goal or a performance goal or anything like that, that's always going to be preceded by what's going on from a physiological perspective, what's going on metabolically. So that's kind of how I break down metabolism and get people out of the mindset of like, well, if I eat this and my metabolism's slow, then I gain this, or if I eat this, I'm in trouble kind of thinking, and understand that metabolism is very dynamic. And even the idea of something like maintenance calories can be a little bit of a moving target, just because we have these variables that influence, that calorie expenditure.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of like, talking about metabolism and, this concept of, metabolic adaptation, or we could chat about like adaptive physiology, right? Can you kind of explain like what the term adaptive physiology means in the sense of
Yeah,
metabolism?
for sure. So I refer to adaptive physiology as like the five Fs. I almost dropped something. That's why sometimes
You're
I'll be
good.
podcasting and I'm like holding I'll have like a marker or a pen or AirPods. One time I was on a podcast and like accidentally threw my AirPods. So it's always just fun adventures with Sam. Like not out of like aggression. I was literally just, it's like I'm just moving. It's a non-exercise activity. So we
Yeah.
can
Are
talk
you
about that and
standing
how
right
that
now?
plays. I'm standing at a standing
Yeah,
desk.
me too. I like
Yeah.
usually, so I'll like end up like I'll start up here like the beginning of the video if someone's like watching this on, because these are all on YouTube. If you're listening, you're not watching on YouTube. I like start up here and then like slowly by the end of the podcast I'm like down here.
Yeah. I
But
find that I
anyway,
shift my weight because if I don't, I'll lock my knees out.
yeah.
So in terms of adaptive physiology, I talk about the five F's. So feast or famine, which is kind of a hunger related response, fight or flight, and then fertility. So fertility is and our reproductive hormones are largely influenced by what's going on in terms of our energy consumption in the form of food and energy output in the form of exercise. So having healthy testosterone levels or having a healthy cycle for women can be influenced by what's going on with the rest of the body. So adaptive physiology is the idea that we are going to perceive the stressors in our environment and our body will adapt or make changes to enhance our survival. So it's sort of the idea where like safety theory comes from in terms of autoimmune diseases, and Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease, things like that. Or you'll see it pop up in other areas as well. So when you hear a big scary term like adaptive physiology, just understand it's the body's adaptation or response to the environment, both internal and external. And it's really just responding in that way because it wants you to continue to live and increase your chance of surviving. And, thousands of years ago, this would be basically just to reproduce and continue to, ensure the safety of you or your tribe or your humans, your family, or your offspring. So that's kind of adaptive physiology in a nutshell. And then when we talk about adaptive thermogenesis or metabolic adaptation, it's basically the idea of, well, dietary stressors, training stressors, life stressors. When we're chronically dieting, our body will have metabolic adaptations similar to how, I mentioned those five F's. Well, we might have a little bit of a response to that. And so hormonally, what that looks like is when we are chronically dieting, what we typically see is an upregulation of the HPA, which is basically the communication between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals. That's HPA axis, and we'll get a downregulation of that communication between the brain and the thyroid, and then also reproductive hormones as well. So that's kind of referred to as the HPG, or hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or you'll say ovarian axis in women or testicular axis in men. And the idea is we're having less of that reproductive hormone based on the stressors that are going on in the body. Or when it comes to thyroid, we might be getting compromised thyroid conversion to metabolically active thyroid hormone. So metabolic adaptation in a number of ways is driven by what's happening in terms of the body's stress response, as well as just perceived energy availability. So I think the two biggest variables you could ever pay attention to in a transformation are energy and stress. So if I can control the amount of energy my body's taking in, right? Like if I want to lose weight, I need a calorie deficit. But if I'm constantly sending the signal of an energy deficit, that's potentially a problem. Now, if I move out of that and I use a diet break or refeed or nutritional periodization on like a yearly basis, well, I'm going to improve my chances of reaching my physical goals and I'm not experiencing that same metabolic adaptation. So, metabolic adaptation isn't always a bad thing. You can use it to your favor in a reverse diet. It's like your body will adapt to more calories and not necessarily gain tons and tons of weight. Like you'll get more energy expenditure. And it also speaks to some of the downregulation or upregulation that will occur in things like non-exercise activity or even thermic effective food. So it makes sense that like if I'm dieting and I'm eating less food, I'm going to burn less calories digesting the food than if I'm eating more food, I have to burn calories in digestion. So metabolic adaptation is more of just like a scientific fact than it is, or process than it is like to be viewed as good or bad, because the same things that will help you in a reverse diet need to be managed on the way down in a calorie deficit if you're pursuing more of like an intense diet.
Okay. Yeah, that makes complete sense. So in terms of like, you probably heard the term broken metabolism, right? Like, do you feel like that is like something that can actually happen? Because I know like people say, I can't lose weight because my metabolism's broken. Like, how would you respond to someone who might come to you, saying that or thinking that?
Yeah, so I always encourage people to kind of shift their mindset around metabolism. So saying my metabolism is damaged or stuck or broken, when in fact your metabolism is very malleable and it's receiving those inputs that you're sending. So it's like the symptoms that you're experiencing in your life, the biofeedback, or even the amount of fat that you accrue is largely based on decisions that you've made. And so I talk about the idea of like everyone kind of has a metabolic identity. Over a period of years, we make choices related to food and exercise. And as those compound, it's kind of like a compound effect of decisions you've made. That can work really well for you in business. It can work really well in investments. It can work really well in fitness. But if you're not making the appropriate decisions for your body type, for you as a person, or I shouldn't say body type, but for your current physiological needs and physiological status quo, that's ultimately not going to be great for you in the long run. So when someone says I have a broken metabolism or damaged metabolism, first I try to teach them what metabolism is and the idea that it's dynamic, it's moving, it is something that we can change based on inputs in our life, our environment, stressors. The first thing we could do to improve metabolism is, get a little bit more sleep, manage our stress, walk and move a little bit more, maybe change food quality or the amount of food that we're eating. There's a lot of ways we can approach that in a transformation. So I call that like either the 7 pillars of a transformation or the 10 toggles. So we can change everything from micronutrition to macronutrition to, like I said, daily movement and so many other factors that play into metabolism. So if you're feeling stuck, I would audit those areas and check the boxes and make sure that's something you're doing. And then from there, you can determine, okay, I can make these improvements and go from there.
Love it, love it. And is that related to, because I know you have a concept called shreds, right? An easy way to kind of
I
remember
try
these
to put
things.
everything into model. Like, I feel like, so if I were to do it all over again, like when I was a coach, I didn't, like, it seemed like I had to go a lot of different places for information in health and fitness. So when I first got a certification, it was like end of high school. It was always my side hustle in college was personal training and working at a nutrition store and doing some coaching and things like that. And there's like not great ways to explain stuff to people, or it was I had to go to this coach for this and this coach for this other thing, and I'm like, well, how does it all connect? And so I just really try to connect the dots for people. So you asked about shreds or drains and charges. I think you said shreds.
Shreds, yeah. Let's talk
Shreds.
about that and then we can go
Okay,
to
we'll
another one.
talk about that first. So shreds is just the idea that, while you're pursuing a fat loss goal, which most people have body composition goals. So I was like, what if I had a term related to body composition that was easy to remember, that was an acronym that tells you what you need to check, whether you're monitoring this yourself or you're working with a coach, you should ask yourself, how are my shreds? Because they'll indicate whether some sort of adaptive response is taking place in the body. So when we talked about metabolic adaptation earlier, or if you feel like your fat loss has stalled or your energy is compromised, shreds are going to point that out. So shreds stands for sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress. So for example, if someone started to have a gut health issue, well, maybe we pick up on digestion and stress, or maybe they're not getting enough sleep. But if you're checking the boxes on all of those areas for a consistent period of time, you're going to find that more often than not, like you're moving in the right direction for your goals. So that's shreds, and that sort of connects back to both the adaptive physiology concept, and even when we're monitoring energy balance, we can know that, well, if my shreds are really starting to kind of like bottom out, like I'm not getting great sleep, my energy's not great, my digestion's off, stress is high, that's usually a good indication that maybe I need a diet break, or maybe I need to adjust my training or change whatever it is that I'm doing. Obviously, we don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again if it's compromising our results. So that's, kind of what I'm paying attention to when I look at shreds, is it should dictate future dietary decisions as well as like future training decisions, or maybe you need a deload if you're an athlete and you train very intensely, things like that.
Gotcha. So you're saying that it's not just about calories in, calories out. There's a whole bunch of other things to be paying attention to, right?
It's both, right? So
Mm-hmm.
energy, like I always consider energy as like a primary consideration, and then I would classify some of these other areas as like stress or hormones, or metabolism is basically looking at both the amount of energy that's coming in through the diet, perceived energy availability, which might be the amount of fat stored I have on my body, the lack of fat stored on my body, like what I've been eating recently. So a lot of people think of energy just as this daily thing, and I try to get people out of that mindset of like, okay, what am I feeding my body on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, as well as my accessibility to food. Because obviously someone who is, if they were in a position of starving, like metabolic adaptation would be used to conserve energy, and we don't want our body to be conserving energy or be this like miser of energy all the time. If it gets super thrifty, that's not a great thing, because we do want energy expenditure. We do want some energy wasting. At times it makes it easier to lose body fat. Also, non-exercise activity really helps with that a ton, in addition to your exercise activity. So calories are important, but I think when you're applying the laws of thermodynamics to these other areas, so you're taking a concept of something in a lab, which is true, it is science, but you have all these other areas of science that need to commingle with that area. It can be challenging sometimes for people to reconcile that. So I try to, pull from both areas in terms of, this is how you make sense of the connection between the two. Because if I eat less, that could be a stressor on my body. Or maybe I'm eating the same, but I'm signaling to my body like, hey, you know, you need to hold on to this food because of the environment we're currently experiencing. So what can I do to tell my body that I'm in a great environment? It's like, get outside, get some sunlight, like breathe, walk,
Mm-hmm.
walk, do all of those basic things to take care of yourself. It's going to change your body's receptivity to the food, because it's about energy, yes, but it's also about my body's receptivity to that energy that I'm consuming, whether that's a protein, whether that's a carb, whether that's fat, whether it's all three of them. We need to think about, how's my body going to respond to that nutrition, and a lot of that priming that goes on is based off of our habits and behaviors and daily decisions and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of like kind of hormonal outputs, and you talked about chronic dieting and maybe being in a calorie deficit for a long time. What kind of happens? Like, can we just go over like some of the kind of basics in terms of hormones? Like how do our hormones adapt to that, or how, like, if you're in a calorie deficit for a long period of time? We talked about metabolic adaptation, and obviously this is part of that. But can you speak to like specifically like some of the hormones that may be like adapting or downregulating to this chronic deficit, and you know preventing you from seeing further results?
Yeah, for sure. So usually, you're going to see changes in like across the board in a lot of the important hormones, whether it's adrenals, thyroid, and testosterone. I do want to tie this to calories a little bit so people understand, well, where do hormones show up. And so if I don't have an optimal hormonal profile, I might feel tired or fatigued or lethargic. part of total daily energy expenditure includes movement. So it's my baseline activity or it's basically basal metabolic rate, what my body burns before my daily activities. Then I'm going to add in my daily activities. Then I'm going to add in exercise and also the calories I burn from food. And so when we're going through that process of metabolic adaptation, or in the research they call it adaptive thermogenesis, what's typically happening, mostly you could argue like the kind of metabolic driver is free T3, so metabolically active thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone will typically downregulate. Some people talk about leptin and how that plays a role, and you should use refeeds and do all of that. I think refeeds have a physiological role, but a lot of it is psychological, like just having a little bit of a diet break can just give you more willpower, maybe a little bit more resilience, maybe you're more willing to stick, to your plan. Also, what it does in terms of stress. So when you consume more food, you're probably going to get an insulin response. Insulin's counter-regulatory to cortisol, so that can be super powerful in terms of bringing down cortisol levels. So the hormones that are affected, in the way that I would explain it, is really it's a combination of like the adrenals that we talked about, reproductive hormones that we talked about, and thyroid. And the way that those connect is cortisol does a couple things. It influences conversion from our thyroid hormone reserve, which is like a fuel tank, into like the active form of the hormone that we need. It also influences reproductive hormones. So like guys, for example, cortisol will inhibit a protein called star protein, which basically transfers cholesterol into mitochondria to make androgens. So, or to make steroid hormones, really. But because of that, we'll see it show up in a lot of different ways, but I don't want the audience or, the listeners to like try to memorize every little way that like hormones are affected, and more so just understand that there's like a cascade of reactions. And generally what's happening is, you're going to see changes in your biofeedback. You might see some lower, testosterone levels, both in men and women. In women, oftentimes when stress is high and chronic dieting, progesterone levels might drop. Cycle health may, be a little bit haywire in an intense diet phase. So it's called HELP, high estrogen, low progesterone in a lot of cases. Cortisol levels will change. So really the answer to like, well, what hormones change is, a lot of them are going to change just based on your food consumption and your activity level. And the good news is you can change that based on food consumption and activity level, or adjusting like the amount of recovery inputs that you have relative to the stressors in your life. So if you're going to go through and basically, you know, put all of these extra stressors, like take away food, exercise more, add extra workouts, what can I do is I can add, more sleep, or maybe I have a little bit more parasympathetic activity, or different things that I enjoy to basically have like a checks and balances system when it comes to recovery. So for the audience listening, like, yes, dieting will influence your hormones, but that's normal. They're usually transient changes. If you're a healthy individual, meaning during a diet, you may see a slight decrease. If you come back up to maintenance calories, they should change positively. Now, the issue is when people diet chronically over and over and over again and don't ever give their body a break, or they're always on the next diet or the next thing, that's when they run into issues and begin to have problems where maybe they are subclinically hypothyroid now, or they do have adrenal insufficiency or some cortisol progression that's leading them to feel not very good. But usually before people blame their hormones and use hormones as a scapegoat, I like to encourage them to check the boxes on, are you sleeping? Are you getting outside? Are you doing the basics? Are you recovering from your workouts? Are you fueling yourself appropriately? Because sometimes if we tackle those, like, you're going to see hormonal improvements and potentially body composition improvements, because now, when we revisit that total daily energy expenditure equation that factors in all these different elements, we're getting more output from so many different things. I'm eating more, so the amount of calories I burn in digestion goes up. Well, I'm eating more, so now I also feel like, instead of sitting on the couch and instead of Netflix and chill and Netflix and chill, I'm actually going to, go out and maybe walk my dog or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways that your body will begin expending energy and like moving you towards your goals when you're not constantly like deprived all the time. And that's oftentimes what happens with adaptation. And some people do blame hormones and they don't have a good pulse and energy balance. So I do want to be really clear to the audience that there are some folks listening who probably really, really, truly are tracking correctly and super active and putting a lot of stress on their body. And then there's also probably a handful of people who are maybe not tracking correctly and overestimate their activity relative to what they're actually doing. And it's not that you have a broken metabolism. You need to like reassess some of those inputs, in your transformation. So it can go both ways. It's just important to be honest with yourself about where you fall. I notice that a lot of type A overachievers, burn the candle at both ends personalities tend to do that more is better approach with exercise and dieting. Like I'm just going to pull more calories and exercise more and more and more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just like, bludgeon your body into submission like that. So that's where people run into issues. But I like to give kind of a disclaimer on both sides so people can try to find where they are realistically and then make adjustments based off of that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And that's really, that's actually why I started this podcast, because I was definitely years ago, not that many years ago, but I was definitely a type A personality, like especially getting into the keto low carb space, kind of adopted a ketogenic lifestyle for myself. I had really good results in terms of, losing body fat, but then also like the mental clarity. And I was like, okay, this is the way to do it, right? But then I started, getting into fasting, and then I started fasting more because I thought, more was better, right? And so the reason I started this podcast and really just my business and MetFlex in general is just to help people kind of, because a lot of women who listen to this podcast and a lot of people who listen to this podcast have been in the low carb space or been in the keto space for a while. And they've had great results, in the beginning, and then they kind of start to not get great results. And I've gone through that myself and with a lot of clients. And it's kind of like talking to what you said, going, down the extremes and then not really figuring out how to get out of that. And so I kind of want to get your opinion on, you mentioned carbs for recovery and kind of the opposites of, cortisol and insulin and the importance of that. So for anybody like listening to this podcast who is maybe coming out of being on a strict ketogenic diet or a low carb diet and wanting to implement more carbs, what would you like? Can you just talk to maybe the benefits of carbohydrates for someone who's maybe in a very stressed out state or, at a plateau in terms of not being able to see the results that they might have gotten, in the beginning? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah,
Kind of a
for sure.
roundabout question.
No, I think I get where you're going. So looking at carbohydrates, you want to understand, same thing with protein or fat too, is like what's the function of the nutrient. So if you're someone who enjoys CrossFit or, a high intensity form of exercise or glycolytic, something that requires sugar and, uses fuel sources very quickly versus I think low carb or keto, as much as they're demonized, I think if you have a very low stress lifestyle and low activity lifestyle, your body can utilize fats as fuel in those situations. The problem is people started taking those acute settings, maybe in medical settings where it works really well or a low stress environment, and they would apply it to someone who's a very high stress, high strung individual with the more is better mentality and the workouts. And then you add fasting on top of that, and you lessen the body's ability to basically get out of that sympathetic state. That so when you're fasting, to an extent, if you're not providing the body with energy, it will figure out ways to mobilize energy. So we have small reserves in liver glycogen, and then we're also, we can. There's other ways to free up energy. We can create new sugar or create new glucose from protein gluconeogenesis. We can do a whole bunch of different things to do it, but it's not the most efficient thing in the world, whereas carbohydrates are just kind of a very efficient way to get energy. So if you're active and you have a lot of muscle, if you train, even for petite ladies listening to this, or guys listening to this, whether you're, you don't need to be a bodybuilder. What I say, like have a relatively substantial amount of muscle, it's relative to your frame and your body composition. So if you have decent amounts of muscle tissue, that muscle is kind of a sink for glucose. And so to support your body, you can provide it with carbohydrates that'll be stored as muscle glycogen post training. Is that's a great example of that. Also, that carbohydrate can just be used and burned as energy from blood glucose, or we can potentially use it to control different states. So, providing the body with carbs can help to shift us into a little bit more of a parasympathetic or rest and digest state. When I mentioned sympathetic earlier, that's that fight or flight. So going back to adaptive physiology from the beginning of the episode, remember in the five F's I mentioned feast or famine, fight or flight, and fertility. Carbohydrates can play an important role in managing some of the F's there. So coming back to kind of cortisol and insulin, they have a counter-regulatory relationship, and that's how insulin can help. Now you can abuse that too, and if you constantly push carbs and you constantly overdo it and constantly have high insulin levels, that's like, in a nutshell, you can give yourself type 2 diabetes. But if you're walking, you're moving, you're lifting, and you're doing all of those things, you're setting yourself up in a really good position where you're going to tolerate those carbohydrates well, and you have something called insulin sensitivity. And when you have good insulin sensitivity, you can have carbohydrates as part of a balanced diet. So I think a lot of the people who benefit from low carb or keto at the beginning, once they have insulin sensitivity, they could potentially shift to a more balanced lifestyle. Especially if you do enjoy things like periodic fasting, you can still do that even with incorporating other macros. So I think that's important to mention.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, I think, we could look at, okay, well, what are other effects, right? So like serotonin, sometimes having a little bit of extra carbs in the evening, people notice that they sleep a little bit better. And you have to figure out and try what works best for you. Some people like not eating before bed and they find that they sleep really well. Other people like to have a little bit of a meal or a snack and it helps keep their blood sugar stable and they sleep really well doing that. So this is where we have to take into account individual sort of context and nuance and your life stressors and your preferred exercise modality. Like if you're just a mall walker or you're very sedentary, you probably don't need the same amount of carbs as someone who wants to do CrossFit or
Mm-hmm.
some form of, I keep using that as an example. It could be anything. Like if you do boot camp, if you do like faster paced movements with both body weight and weights and cardio, you're in a similar boat, even if you're not necessarily like trying to go to the CrossFit games. So I
Mm-hmm.
just try to give those as examples of ways that we can sort of manage both cortisol and insulin. There are things you can do to improve your insulin sensitivity to help your tolerance to carbs, and so that kind of hopefully paints a little bit of a broader, bigger picture of how we can use macronutrients. And also through the macros, you're going to get micronutrients from those foods too. So whether it's potassium from a banana or anything else, like there are other benefits in including a variety of foods in your
Mm-hmm.
daily or weekly intake.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then kind of going to the opposite side of things. So like in terms of fat intake, um, you know, what would you say like would kind of like just from your experience and your expertise in like the hormone realm of things, what would be, because I think this is a big misconception that's out there too. Like the more fats you have, the better off your hormones are going to be because we know that,
Right.
but I think that there is like just again it's like a little bit of a misconception in terms of more fat the better, right? Is there like some threshold or like a floor? um
Yeah. So it kind of depends on your body size. I think I get where you're going with the question. I
yeah.
think a lot of people forget. So the where that came from is hormones. The base of it is like a mother hormone called pregnenolone. Before pregnenolone, we have cholesterol. So a lot of people were like, well, if I just eat more fat with cholesterol in it, I'm going to get more cholesterol. It's going to be great for my hormones. And that's if you eat zero fats, probably not optimal, probably not ideal. Like we also want a healthy, omega 6 to omega 3 ratio. We want, the right amount of monounsaturates as well as those polyunsaturates and some saturates, and some saturates are better than others. And we can benefit from short chain fatty acids or medium chain triglycerides, things like that. So there's a lot of nuance even within fats, but looking at cholesterol, you have to understand the liver can create cholesterol. So even aside from the dietary cholesterol you have, your liver can also do a lot of these things in moving the body towards hormone production, and that's why having a healthy liver is important for healthy hormones and detoxification and all of those things. So it's a little bit of a misnomer that like more fat is better, because you can push yourself to a point where, let's say you accumulate body fat from a result of the dietary fat you're eating, because fat does have 9 calories per gram. So if I'm eating 100 grams of fat, that's a really quick way to get 900 calories in really, really fast. And for some people, maybe that's half your daily intake or something like that in terms of overall calories, or maybe you eat more than that and it's a third, but it's still a lot of calories. So if you overshoot that, that's going to influence hormones as well, because body fat does signal other, cascades and reactions in the body, versus muscle tissue is going to have an entirely different reaction. So more fat isn't always necessarily better. So like don't just dump butter in your coffee or whatever just because you're like thinking it's better for your hormones, when you do need some fat. But I would be hesitant to put like a set gram amount because people have different sizes and people have different internal health. Um, but I find that depending on where protein and carbs are, that's going to influence your fat. So I usually like to set protein first, folks, especially who are very active. And then depending on your personal preference for flavor and your activity of choice, really your activity of choice is going to drive it almost a little bit more because it's going to dictate the body's need for certain nutrients. So then I'll kind of break down and say, okay, well, I have this much going towards this in protein,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe that's a gram per pound or something like that. If you're on a non-ketogenic diet, it's a little bit more balanced for athletes and active individuals. And then, then maybe we backtrack, incorporate fats and carbs to fill in the remaining balance of total calories. So that's kind of how I would approach it. I've told people that if I had like a gun to my head and I had to just start someone somewhere and I didn't know a lot about that person, I sometimes say like zero point 0.4 grams per pound, but that's like you have a gun to my head and I'm not comfortable answering this question. So if you're at home listening, like don't just do that because I said that, do like a food log or track your food. See where you're at first in terms of your fat before you go up or down to that. For some people that might be high fat, for other people that might be very low fat. So I pick a number in the middle because it tends to be fairly moderate. It's a little bit less than half your body weight in grams. It's more towards maintenance calories. So you might not diet on that amount. You might diet on 0.3 or zero point 0.2. It may get lower progressively. You also have to remember the bigger you are, if I was 300 pounds versus being just under 200 pounds, that's going to make a big difference too in terms of where I'm kind of filling out that total calorie balance once I've met certain needs. So that's, I know you asked me kind of a certain amount for hormones. I wouldn't say that that's like a magical number for hormones, but if you're really, really struggling, I would say set your protein first and then figure out how active you are. And if you do eat carbohydrates, make sure your workouts are supported with peri-workout nutrition, like pre and post workout carbohydrate, because you're going to be more insulin sensitive during those times for the most part. Unless you have a really hard time sleeping and you prefer having like a little snack or something, you could save some carbohydrates for later in the day. Some people do well with having like fruit or something that will help with liver glycogen, like going into sleep. So
Mm-hmm.
you could save some carbs for the evening and then you can fill out the balance with fat. Or if you're more of a fat dominant diet style and not a lot of carbs after, figuring out protein and stuff, maybe you're figuring out fat. Unless you're
Mm-hmm.
straight keto, then obviously you need fat to be kind of a higher percentage of nutrition and total nutrients.
Gotcha. So we kind of, I just want to talk about a little bit about protein because you mentioned it and we hit on carbs and fats. So in terms of setting protein, I'm a huge advocate of a higher protein approach, especially even like within a ketogenic approach. Not like a standard ketogenic diet, but more so a higher protein. And I've always been kind of in that realm for myself and with my clients. But I'm curious, like how you go about setting protein based off of body weight, activity. Like, what's your kind of methodology behind that?
I think all of the above. I mean, the longer that I've done nutrition and try to help other coaches in programming for their clients, the more I've realized like there's not one equation or one answer. Because if someone's obese, I'm not going to put them at a gram per pound of body weight. Someone who's very active and an athlete or bodybuilding or um, I just tolerates protein really well, I'm going to push the protein higher. Maybe it's above a gram per pound. I think there's studies, I don't know if this is the ISSN, maybe an affiliated organization that did like, it was between 3.4 and 4.4 grams per kilogram, which would have come out to, I could be doing the math wrong. I think there was a study that would have come out to basically be about 1.5 grams per pound of body weight,
Mm.
being safe and well tolerated and being beneficial for the individuals in terms of like lean body mass and things like that. So I'm fine going up to that threshold. Now, the issue some people have is they can't tolerate it from a digestive perspective because if you don't have the requisite enzymes and hydrochloric acid and different things to break down that protein, some people it feels just like a rock in their stomach once they get above a certain threshold. And part of it is you want to titrate up, not just go from you were eating 20 grams to trying to eat 200 grams. So that makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say for healthy individuals or people who are close to their goal body weight or not too far off or looking to recomp, I think keeping it like body weight in grams of protein or a little bit higher. The only reason I might start lower is if it's not a realistic goal and the person's been woefully under eating their protein, I'll ramp them up to where they need to be. But I'm personally pro protein, so
Mm.
like kind of an advocate of keeping it in and then basing it off of hunger and satiety and recovery. So if someone's hungry all the time, protein is great because it can promote fullness. And if someone is a, someone who trains intensely, an athlete, or just enjoys lifting weights or having an active lifestyle, they're going to benefit from having that protein in there. So I'll usually go as recovery is indicating, and then as digestion permits, because that's kind of the rate limiting factor along with total calories. So even though protein is a little bit more thermogenic in a sense that you burn a certain amount of
Mhm.
calories in digestion relative to other nutrients, I still think you still have to account for balance across like your micronutrient profile, total macros, total calories, and a lot of people will just hit that point, like I said, a couple times, digestion, or they're just not enjoying it. So it's like
Mhm.
making sure you're still enjoying that amount of protein. Do you have like a number that you like, or kind of like a gram
Yeah,
threshold?
so pretty much in the same camp as you. Like between one, and again, this goes off of like how much you weigh and all that. Like you said, if you weigh 300 plus pounds, 1 gram per pound is probably not a good place. That's probably gonna be too much, right? So I usually do like zero point 0.8 to 1.2 grams per pound for someone who is, like you said, more active, closer to their quote unquote ideal body weight. And then like if we're going into a cut or something like that, I like to push protein a little bit higher just because, um, you know, like you said, it's the most satiating nutrient. And then also you do have that, like you said, the thermic effect of food. We know protein is 25 to 30% thermogenic compared to fats and carbs. So if people are struggling with feeling satiated and then also just want to eat a little bit more while you're kind of in that deficit, I found that, higher protein, just from my experience, tends to be beneficial for that. Because it's not like, 25 to 30% versus, you know, what's fats like 0 to 3%, and carbs are like 5 to 7%. The thermic effect of food for those, is that right?
Oh, I was
Around
like
there.
listening to you rattle off percentages, and I was like, I thought that's where you're going with that. I think protein's close to 30, and usually
Hmm.
carbs and fats are the lowest, and they're going to be under 10%, maybe even under
Yeah,
5%,
yeah,
depending on,
yeah.
testing. And I'm assuming there's got to be some individual variance, but it's
Yeah.
I think fats and carbs are kind of negligible thermic effect versus, I mean, you've got to burn calories in digestion, but I wouldn't like stay up at night worried about, well, I need this many carbs because of
Yeah.
thermic effect versus I think if you hit your protein goals and you can fill out your calorie needs with your carbs and fats, you're
Hmm.
probably going to be in a good spot, and then just monitor if you're in a deficit or not. And I think it's hard to bank on the thermic effect portion of like
Hmm.
how that's going to play out. So I think know that it exists, know that protein is a thermogenic nutrient in that sense. It requires calories to break it down and digest it, but also because it requires energy to break it down and digest it, sometimes it can be harder for some folks to tolerate
Hmm.
if they're not used to it. But, chewing your food well, spacing your meals out a little bit, and maybe a digestive enzyme, different things can really help to improve your tolerance to protein.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. Cool. Okay, so I think that was pretty much all the kind of questions I had. I think we hit on a lot of different topics, right?
I
From
feel like we did. There was maybe
Yeah,
one thing that you mentioned
I know. I'm trying.
earlier, drains and charges,
Oh
but
yeah, drains and charge. That's why I was like, I'm like
okay.
trying to think about what I'm missing.
No,
But
no,
yes,
it's
yeah.
I
Let's talk
wasn't
about it.
sure if you decided last minute you wanted to go with shreds instead. So drains and charges,
Mhm.
speaking, it fits well with our carb conversation because we were talking about how cortisol and insulin are kind of counter-regulatory, and that makes sense when you think about. A lot of people forget they just demonize cortisol as this like this is a stress hormone and this is bad, but you need some cortisol. Like you want to have a cortisol awakening response, and you also would feel really crappy if you didn't have cortisol. So when we're thinking about it, understanding that cortisol is an alertness response, and while people view it as a fight or flight response, it is, in some ways, it's an alertness response. It's preparing you to deal with whatever's coming your way, and with that alertness, being in that state, you may mobilize energy substrates rather than having to eat. It's not like, oh, let me go grab this fast food because that didn't exist thousands of years ago. And so the way that our body is wired, it's going to require energy to face whatever threat we're dealing with. And we do have energy reserves, but also, dumping specific neurotransmitters as well as energy prepares you for that fight or flight response or that alertness response that you're having. So that's more of a sympathetic state. And then so tying it into the cortisol, insulin, and then drains and charges moves more to the nervous system perspective. So rather than worry so much about macronutrients and insulin and things like that, we can understand that a drain on the body is something that basically, let's say I am a chronic dieter, would be pushing my calorie deficit further or adding more stress to my body. That would be a drain, or lack of sleep would be a drain. Charge would be basically, maybe that person needs a reverse diet, or maybe if I was under eating on protein, that could be a charge. So I came up with the idea of drains and charges, explaining to clients, because so many people obviously have a smartphone and they understand, well, each night or sometime during the day, I need to charge my phone, or I can't, answer texts or phone calls or emails or whatever. And your body is very similar in that it does need to be charged, and there are things that drain your body. Now, there's individual benefits here. So if I was obese or overweight, a calorie deficit, or a diet and movement for me would be a charge, because my health markers will improve when I lose weight. So for one person, a calorie deficit is a charge. It'll improve energy. They'll have a little bit more vigor, more vitality. Lab markers will improve. Now, if I take someone who's underweight or even has an eating disorder or something like that, and I take away food, they're already micronutrient deficient. That's a further drain versus for the overweight person, that's a charge. So understand there's like a situational, difference between people. There's nuance, there's context to it. The only universal charges really are sleep and walking, I found, or like breathing, because walking is both parasympathetic and also mobilizes, I shouldn't say mobilize, it burns energy and is parasympathetic at the same time. So you're moving, it's good for you. It can also improve blood glucose markers, insulin sensitivity, and lower stress. It's one of the only things that's going to do all of that at the same time, especially if you're outside and not super stressed out. Now, the other would be sleep. So unless you're sleeping all the time, which is highly unlikely, most people, like a universal charge would be sleep. So if you're looking for tangible examples, going for a walk, some mindful breathing, and sleep are really like the three universal charges. Now, what you do with your diet, what you do with your training, that could be a drain or a charge depending on you as an individual. So what I used to do with clients and what I do with mentees a lot of the times is sitting down and figuring out, okay, what are your unique sort of drains? What are your unique charges and opportunities? Charges would be opportunities to improve and make progress. Drains, we'd want to eliminate that, because if I sit down, or this probably started like 3 to 5 years ago, but I would get someone's intake form and I'd be like, oh my God, like if I were to make a piece of paper and fold it in half and write all the things that you have to do that stress you out and aren't good for your body, and then all of the things that are actually beneficial and restorative, there's 2 things over here, 12 things over here, maybe more. And I was like, how do I explain this to them without I'm not trying to get bogged down in science, but I'm also not trying to overwhelm them, but I also don't want to make them feel bad that they're doing everything wrong. So how do I come up with an analogy for it? And so that's basically where the drains and charges thing came from.
I love it. I love it. Definitely really good way to explain it. So for you personally, would you say besides sleep and walking, is there anything that you personally do on a daily basis that quote unquote charges you, maybe a specific morning routine, meditation, journaling, anything like that?
I think it can be, so that's a very conventional fitness answer. So I'm going to give you guys outside the box. I think this is where having pets or connection, or maybe you enjoy music. I'm doing a terrible job of this right now when I'm running business, but I play guitar and I haven't played it recently. I'm not doing a good job of committing to that, but that would be an example for me where that would be probably more parasympathetic, a little bit more of taking my mind off of other things. If you have a dog or a cat and that creates a positive environment for you and you're just kind of unplugged for a bit, that could be a charge. So for me, I'm huge animal person, so
Mm-hmm.
that's really big for me. Music is really big, so even if I'm not playing music, I still like to like listen to music and things like that. So those would be good ones for me. I do have like a little bit of a morning routine, but I try to like adapt it and change it depending on kind of what's going on. For me, sometimes just feeling organized and like knowing what I have to do and maybe writing a little bit
Mm-hmm.
helps put put my mind in the right place.
Mm-hmm.
And my the way that I used to frame it, I haven't done this quite as much lately, but I think it's good if the audience is looking to transition into something, is you can kind of do a hybrid of like a lot of people talk about like gratitude and journaling and critical tasks, and depending on what like self-improvement person you listen to, you're going to get a different opinion. So I would just divide like a piece of paper into three sections, or like a notebook or a planner, whatever, and I would have kind of like three things from the past day or past week or past month that are going well, things you can be grateful for. The middle is like you're being very present and acknowledging kind of like what is in the moment, because I think a lot of us struggle with either we're in the past or we're in the future. Like
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned kind of being type A, high achiever, burning the candle at both ends. A lot of those people tend to live in the future. I shouldn't say those people. I'm one of those people. So you end up being in
Same.
the future and you're like
Yeah.
trying to like work backwards. So in that situation, I think coming back to the present is super helpful. But then the bottom third would be future. So you could write things as if they've already happened. So it's basically whether you want to call it like visions or manifesting things, or it could be affirmations. Basically, writing things as if they're already true about yourself, even if they haven't already happened yet, and things that you're trying to do. So when I was really on top of like getting into a morning routine, it was that those three things. It was top third, middle third, bottom third, so kind of like a past, present, future. And then sometimes it'll include music, podcast, walking, um,
Mm-hmm.
mobility, just kind of depends on. For a while I was doing cold showers just because I was like, I'm going to commit to doing.
Yeah.
I was like, this seems like a hard thing, so I'm going to do it. I did it
Yeah.
for like 90 days. I was like, I'm
Wow.
pretty sure. I was like, I think I've proved to myself that I can do this, but like, is this actually helping me? I think is like, I got to a point where I try to like try stuff and then
Mm-hmm.
see if it helps. Like for a while I was doing morning walks all the time, and I would basically, I'll see how I feel. I'll look at like my daily productivity as well as just like my health. And for me, you know, based on my activity level and stuff already, it was like, I don't know that like adding more activity was like the answer versus like maybe more chill time or sleeping, or,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people wake up early to do like a 2 hour morning routine, and it's like the sleep might
Yeah.
have, put them in a better state for that. So I'm definitely not the morning routine guru for anyone listening, but that's kind of some stuff that I've tried. And I think if you're new to it, something simple would be like the 1 page exercise, because it's not
Mm-hmm.
super overwhelming and it's like something you could incorporate. I've had people just leave a notebook at their desk when they get to work in the morning, or maybe it's, you know, downstairs and you make coffee or you have water or whatever it is, you sit down and you do that as part of your day. And that's always been a pretty easy one to incorporate. But for me, it's um, probably a mix of like outside time, pets,
Yeah.
music. Like those are kind of
Yeah.
my
Yeah, I'm pretty much the same too, like just trying different things out. And like I never used to have a morning routine until probably like 2 years ago, and then I've just, you adapt, you try different things and see what
yeah.
works, and things are going to work at one point in your life and then they're just maybe not going to be as beneficial at another point in your life. Like right now, I actually just got a puppy a month ago. Um so that is, and it's like you said, it's a stress reliever um at some points, but then it's also stress. So it's like this
Yeah, my
balancing
my
out.
dog's 10, so it's
Okay.
like it's totally different once you're
Yeah.
through that stage.
I haven't gotten to the stress relief on its own stage. We're in the stressful stage right now. But it's definitely like my morning routine that I usually do before, I got her, is put on the back burner because obviously I have to take care of her. But, I think it is like there's times throughout the day where I get a little stressed out and then I just go like look at my puppy and I just get happy. So it's definitely little things like that. Whatever makes, if you're listening to this, whatever makes you, you know, feel good, right? And you have that stress relief. And that's something that, like we both work with clients, and that's something that like I'm super on top of my clients about, that just finding something that is a stress relief. that is not exercise, because I used to make that mistake where I would say, okay, my stress relief is exercise. Like that's where, I get out of my head, all of that. But we know, to a point that is a stressor in itself, right? So,
Yeah.
um,
I tried not to answer with that because I didn't want to set a bad example for your audience. For me, I'd say it still is in some ways, but I've also done a much better job of dialing it back. Whereas I used to, it would be like 110% all the time. Whereas now I understand, okay, that's part of your week, and then there can be other types of movement to complement like the intense workouts and stuff like that too.
yeah, for sure. Cool. So I do have one last question. I'm going to put you on the spot a
Okay.
little bit. This is something
All
that I
right.
ask usually at the end. So, is there anything that you've changed your mind about in the last year, and why? Doesn't have to be nutrition. It can be literally anything. Nutrition, fitness, whatever.
So we should talk about the election. No, I'm just kidding. You're like, you're like, that was like a huge eye roll. No, anything I've changed my mind about.
Or something that you've been focusing on, maybe, this year versus last year, and kind of change your perspective on.
Whew.
It doesn't have to be last year. It could be like
Yeah,
even
I don't know.
years
So for
ago.
me, I guess a mix. So something I'm changing my perspective on, maybe learning in like a group environment, just individual, both in terms of my teaching. I think there's a lot that can be said from learning from community and peers. I think this year I'm emphasizing community a lot more, even in my group for coaches, like spending a lot of time in there versus before I had it, but I wasn't super focused on that. The podcast is a big thing for me in terms of was something originally a long time ago that a mentor was like, oh, it's too early. You don't need to do that yet. And that's been like one of the biggest things for me over the past year. I'm just past my like 1 year anniversary on my podcast. I think we're at like episode 105 or something now. So that's a big one. And then, just from a science perspective, a lot of people, when they're taught about hormones and physiology, there's this thing called the pregnenolone steal. I'm not going to bore your audience because they're not like all coaches and stuff who are interested in that. But basically, that's not really a thing anymore, or at least that's not how they should be teaching it. I think it's still in some textbooks. It's kind of a colloquial way of explaining how when you're stressed out, your like progesterone levels might be lower or your testosterone levels might be lower, and the truth is like there's no single pool of pregnenolone or cholesterol or whatever. Like this is happening in different cells. So like one cell makes like an adrenal, like a cell in the adrenals makes hormones related to that and
Mm-hmm.
cortisol, for example, whereas a cell in the ovaries would make hormones like female reproductive hormones, for example. So that's something that I've changed my mind about. I'm trying to like spread. Sorry to the audience if that was incredibly
No,
boring
you're
and not
good.
interesting for you, but that's something I changed, as well as I think emphasizing community and learning for like people who kind of follow me. And even in my own learning too, I think it's because like I've sort of branched out in that way too in my peer group. So those would be, I think I gave you like three, so that should
No,
be
no, cool. Yeah.
okay.
Awesome, awesome. Well, this was really fun. I learned a lot. Hopefully, people listening learned more about metabolism, hormones. I know it's one of those subjects that can be super confusing, and I think that you really broke it down in a way that's understandable, which was awesome and really, one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on, because I think you do a good job at that. So, do you want to just like tell everybody? I know you mentioned your podcast. Do you want to just tell the listeners where they can find you with your podcast, maybe website, social media, all that stuff?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Sam Miller Science on everything. Website is sammillerscience.com. Instagram is Sam Miller Science, and the podcast is Sam Miller Science. The only thing that I'm not is, which I don't hang out on a lot, is Twitter, and that's because
Mm-hmm.
there's a character limit, so I only have one M instead of two M's with my full name on Sam Miller Science. So that's the easiest way. If there are any coaches who listen to this, I do have a Facebook group for coaches, but you can find that on my website if you scroll down, and I also mention it on Instagram. So I spend the most time on Instagram and my podcast, so that's probably the easiest way to connect with me.
Okay.
And yeah, I would say coaches or anyone listening, I mean, I do have some blogs and stuff on my site. The
Mm-hmm.
podcast is more like generally informative for everyone. For folks who are general listeners, I think the podcast and Instagram would be most informative, whereas like website, Facebook group, some of my other resources and workshops and stuff, it's a little bit more like geared towards coaching and might not be like the best flavor for you guys. So I'd say podcast is great because I do a mix of Q&As, solo episodes, and covering different topics, and I try to keep it, at a level where everybody can understand. So yeah, Sam Miller Science on
Cool.
everything except for Twitter.
Awesome. I will
Oh,
link
maybe
that.
YouTube someday.
Yeah, I'll link all those in the show notes so people can check them out. And I'm thinking that we'll probably have some follow-up questions from some listeners. I also do solo episodes, like I do solo Q&As, and then I do guest episodes as well. And I have usually follow-up questions from guests. So maybe I'll have you back on in the future and we can tackle some Q&As.
Yeah, I'm always happy to do it.
Awesome. Sweet. All right. Thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon.